The wind, a ceaseless, sifting whisper, was my only constant companion. It scoured the desert floor outside, eroding the already crumbling facade of the abandoned factory I called home and laboratory. The colossal structure, once a hub of forgotten industry, now housed an array of custom-built equipment, a labyrinth of humming servers, blinking monitors, and snaking cables that were far more intricate than any conveyor belt system the building had ever known. My world was here, within these reinforced walls, insulated from the distractions of a world I'd long since ceased to understand or engage with. My name is UserXL, and for the better part of a decade I'd been chasing echoes. Not the mundane kind, but the faint, almost imperceptible whispers from the deepest reaches of the cosmos. Most people found the idea of spending years in this self-imposed solitude, poring over reams of spectral data, an act of madness. I considered it the only sane pursuit. While others squabbled over terrestrial minutiae, I sought the fundamental truths embedded in the fabric of space-time, a pursuit that demanded absolute focus and an almost pathological aversion to human company. My days blurred into a seamless continuum of observation, analysis, and hypothesis. I'd trek out to the dried riverbed, a vast, ancient scar across the landscape a few miles from the factory, where I'd meticulously installed my primary receiving array. The location was perfect, geologically stable, devoid of electromagnetic interference, and far enough from any significant settlements that light pollution was a non-issue. The huge parabolic dishes, gleaming like forgotten monuments under the stark moonlight, turned their hungry mouths skyward, patiently sifting through the galactic static. It was during one of these endless vigils, bathed in the sickly glow of my main console, that it happened. I was sifting through the previous night's acquisition, a routine task, when a specific frequency band snagged my attention. It wasn't a burst, not a pulsar, not the familiar hiss of a quasar. It was different. The initial sweep registered it as an anomaly, a blip of peculiar coherence against the otherwise chaotic background. My fingers, accustomed to the dance across the keyboard, paused, hovering over the controls. My heart gave a faint, almost imperceptible tremor, the kind I feel when I've been working on a complex problem for weeks and suddenly see the first glimmer of a solution. This was it. The signal was weak, almost buried in the cosmic background radiation, but unmistakably structured. It pulsed with an intricate rhythm, a pattern far too complex to be natural noise, yet utterly unlike any known astrophysical phenomenon. "No!" I whispered to the empty room, my voice a dry rasp. My eyes, usually weary from endless screen time, sharpened, focusing on the wave patterns rippling across the monitor. The complexity of it was staggering. It wasn't a simple on-off binary, nor was it a repetitive sequence. It was more like layers, like an impossibly intricate tapestry woven from pure energy, each thread distinct, yet contributing to a larger, unfathomable design. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and deduction, whirred, attempting to categorize, to understand. I spent the next 72 hours in a feverish blur. Sleep became a forgotten luxury. Food was an afterthought. The world outside the factory walls, the dried riverbed where my dishes still faithfully listened, ceased to exist. I was entirely consumed by the signal. I ran every algorithm I possessed, developed new ones on the fly, cross-referenced it with every known database, every theoretical model. Nothing matched. It defied classification. The signal's source, triangulation confirmed, was not from within our galaxy, nor even from a neighboring one. That detail alone should have been enough to send a jolt of pure scientific ecstasy through me. It did, initially. This was groundbreaking, world-changing. This was the moment I had dedicated my entire life to. But beneath the thrill, a subtle current of unease began to ripple. It wasn't a fear of the unknown. I thrived on the unknown. It was something else. A profound wrongness that began to seep into the edges of my perception. The signal wasn't just complex. It felt too complex, almost impossibly so, like trying to comprehend a language that had no roots in any human construct, a language whose very grammar was an alien concept. The patterns in the signal, as I began to tentatively decode fragments, didn't seem to be transmitting information in any conventional sense. They were more like a description, a vast, sprawling, non-linear description of something I couldn't yet grasp. And the more I delved, the more I felt a strange disassociation. The numbers, the graphs, the spectral analyses, they were all perfectly logical, yet my mind struggled to assemble them into a coherent picture. It was like looking at the individual brushstrokes of a painting, understanding each one, but being utterly incapable of seeing the finished masterpiece. My isolation, once a source of strength and focus, began to feel like a vulnerability. There was no one to discuss this with, no one to bounce ideas off, no one to anchor me to a consensus reality. Every interpretation, every new hypothesis was mine alone. And the signal, though just a series of fluctuating energy waves, felt increasingly like it was looking back. Not with eyes, of course, but with an immense, indifferent presence that permeated the data. The air in the factory, usually stale but familiar, started to feel heavy, charged. My skin prickled. The signal was a discovery, yes, but it was also an intrusion. The hum of the processors was a constant, low thrum against the desert's silence, a counterpoint to the relentless wind outside. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting quality of the light filtering through the grime-caked windows of the abandoned factory. My world had shrunk to the flickering screens and the intricate tangle of wires that snaked across the floor, all dedicated to the signal. It was everything. Every waking thought, every desperate, half-dreamed moment revolved around its decipherment. I hadn't slept properly in what felt like weeks. My eyelids felt like sandpaper scraping against gritty eyeballs, and my thoughts were a slow, viscous current, often snagging on non-sequiturs. The coffee, brewed thick and black in an ancient percolator, did little more than add a bitter edge to my tongue. My reflection in the dark glass of a dormant monitor showed a gaunt face, eyes wide and bloodshot, framed by a wild tangle of hair. I barely recognized the person staring back. It was just a shell driven by the singular, unyielding purpose of understanding the message. My resources, once ample, were dwindling. The factory, vast and empty, felt like a drain, powering the custom arrays, and the processing units required a constant flow of scavenged fuel and meticulously repaired generators. I had sold off almost everything of value. I owned old research papers, rare first editions, even the vintage telescope I'd inherited from my mentor. The last of my savings had gone into acquiring a specific spectral analyzer from a contact in the city, a quiet, stoic dealer who never asked too many questions. I'd driven the battered utility vehicle for 2 days straight, the desert highway a shimmering ribbon under the merciless sun, returning with the bulky, crucial piece of equipment. That journey, the frantic installation, it was all a blur now, just another necessary sacrifice. The event was less a single moment and more a continuous, grinding effort. I'd pore over the spectral data, looking for patterns, for repetition, for anything that hinted at structure. The signal wasn't just noise. It had an underlying, almost rhythmic quality, like a breath held for eons before being exhaled. I'd found a recurring sequence, a complex fractal-like signature that repeated across different frequencies. It wasn't a language I understood, but it was something. It was the first tangible proof that this wasn't random cosmic background radiation. This was deliberate. The paranoia began subtly. I'd spin around, convinced I'd heard my name, only to find the vast, echoing space of the factory empty, save for the rhythmic blinking of my equipment. I started checking the locks on the heavy, rusting doors multiple times, even though I knew no one else came out this far. The isolation, once a comfort, was becoming a cage, and I felt as if something was pressing in on its walls. One evening, after nearly 3 days without proper sleep, the fractal signature on the main display seemed to ripple. It wasn't a glitch in the monitor. The lines themselves appeared to undulate, like water disturbed by an unseen stone. Then, for a fleeting moment, a face coalesced within the pattern. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind only the familiar, intricate lines. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and dismissed it as fatigue, a trick of the light. The next morning, the air in the factory felt heavy, thick with an unspoken presence. My utility vehicle, low on fuel, could still make it a short distance. I drove aimlessly for a while, the desert stretching out in all directions, a vast, indifferent canvas. I found myself drawn towards the dried riverbed, a long, winding scar across the landscape, where ancient water had once carved its path through the rock and sand. The sun beat down, baking the earth, and the air shimmered with heat. The cracked clay of the riverbed floor was a mosaic of browns and reds, broken by the occasional skeletal remains of desert flora. But out here under the vast, empty sky, the paranoia intensified. Every distant shimmer of heat haze seemed to coalesce into a figure at the edge of my vision, a tall, attenuated shape that vanished when I turned my head directly. It wasn't the wind. It was too regular, too deliberate. Then came the reveal. I knelt down, picking up a shard of sun-bleached rock, my fingers tracing its rough edges. As I stared at the intricate network of tiny cracks spiderwebbing across its surface, a pattern emerged. It was the fractal signature. Not an exact replica, but the underlying mathematical structure, the fundamental geometry of the signal was there, etched into the very fabric of the stone. My breath hitched. It wasn't just a hallucination. The signal wasn't just in the factory, on my screens. It was here. It was in the world around me. I looked up, scanning the horizon, my heart thudding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The vastness of the desert no longer felt empty, it felt pervaded. The signal wasn't just broadcasting to me. It was subtly, insidiously interacting with my perception, warping the very reality I inhabited. It was seeping into the world, or perhaps it was simply showing me what had always been there, hidden beneath the veneer of my limited understanding. I wasn't just deciphering a message. I was being rewritten by it. The hum of the processors had been a constant, low thrum against the desert's silence, a counterpoint to the relentless wind outside. My world had shrunk to the flickering screens, the frantic scrawl of my notes, the coffee stains on my desk. But the factory walls, once a sanctuary, had begun to feel like a cage made of dissolving matter. The hum wasn't just in the machines anymore. It was in my teeth, behind my eyes, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to loosen the very fabric of my thoughts. I had to get out. The need was primal, irrational, so I walked. Not to anywhere specific, just away from the thrum, away from the screens that now seemed to stare back with a cold, knowing intelligence. The sun was a brutal, indifferent disk in the sky, baking the earth, and I found myself drawn to a long, winding scar across the landscape, the dried riverbed. The air here was thin, crackling with a dry heat that felt ancient, almost prehistoric. The ground beneath my worn boots was a mosaic of cracked clay, each polygonal shard distinct, yet part of a larger, broken whole. I traced the path of what was once water, a phantom current guiding my steps. But even here in the desolate openness, the signal's influence followed. The cracks in the dried riverbed began to shift. Not physically, not in any way a camera would register, but in my perception. They started as random fissures, then subtly they coalesced. First I saw crude, geometric shapes, triangles, squares, pentagons, repeating with an impossible precision over vast stretches of earth. Then they deepened, grew more intricate, like a language I was almost, but not quite, able to read. They weren't just patterns, they were anti-patterns. A sequence of identical cracks would suddenly break, one shard angled just slightly differently, creating a jarring dissonance that screamed meaninglessness, yet felt profoundly significant. I knelt, pressing my palm against the sun-baked earth. The clay felt cool for a moment, then pulsed with a faint internal warmth, as if the riverbed itself was a dormant, colossal organ. My fingers, calloused from endless hours at the console, suddenly felt alien, disconnected from the command center of my brain. I looked at my own hand, then at the intricate network of lines on the ground, and for a terrifying second I couldn't tell which was the living tissue and which was the inert earth. Time, too, was becoming a liquid, slipping through my grasp. Had I been walking for hours or just minutes? The sun seemed to hang motionless, then suddenly dip towards the horizon as if someone was fast-forwarding the sky. My memories of yesterday, of the day before, were a jumbled mess. A deck of cards shuffled violently, with no discernible order. A deep tremor of derealization snaked through me. The sky above, once a comforting, familiar blue, now felt like a painted backdrop. A vast, indifferent canvas stretched over an even vaster, more indifferent emptiness. Everything I knew, everything I had anchored myself to, was losing its solidity. I pulled out my satellite phone, my fingers fumbling with the familiar device. I needed to talk to someone, anyone who could ground me. My colleague, a pragmatic, level-headed engineer from the consortium, was the only person I thought might listen. I need to tell Ice something. It's about the signal. It's changing things. There was a pause, a beat of static. UserXL, are I all right? I sound a bit off. Are I still at the factory? I know the consortium was asking about my latest report. The report doesn't matter, I snapped, the words bursting out with an urgency that surprised even me. The patterns, they are everywhere. In the earth, in the light. They're not just data, they're fundamental, and the anti-patterns, they unravel everything. It's like the universe is showing me its true face, and it's utterly meaningless. It's always been like this, hasn't it? We just didn't see it. Another pause, longer this time. I could hear a faint office chatter in the background, a distant siren. Life continuing oblivious. UserXL, look, I think I read just stressed, he said, his voice now laced with that familiar, patronizing tone of dismissal. I've been out there alone for too long. I should come back in, get some rest. We can look at the data together properly. He couldn't understand. How could he when his world was still solid, still bound by the comforting illusions of causality and purpose? My world was dissolving into an elegant, terrifying nullity. No, I think I do, he replied, his voice firm, final. You need a break. UserXL, I'm serious. Get some sleep. Call me when you're thinking straight. The line clicked, then went dead. He hadn't heard me. He couldn't. I was truly alone in this perception, adrift in a universe that had shed its skin to reveal an indifferent pattern-generating engine utterly devoid of inherent purpose. I looked at the vast, cracked expanse of the dried riverbed, and for the first time I understood. The patterns, the anti-patterns, the fluid time, they weren't aberrations. They were the truth, and the truth was a horror beyond comprehension. The line clicked, then went dead. The silence that followed was immense, crushing. It wasn't just the silence of the dried riverbed, it was the silence of a cosmic void echoing the profound, horrifying meaninglessness that the signal had revealed. He hadn't heard me. He couldn't. I was truly alone. The dust, fine as ash, coated my tongue. I could taste the mineral tang of the parched earth, the ghost of water that had once rushed through this ancient scar on the land. My breath rasped, dry and uneven, a pathetic counterpoint to the absolute stillness that pressed in from all sides. The late afternoon sun, a merciless white orb in the vast, unbroken sky, seemed to bleach the world of color, leaving everything in shades of muted ochre and gray. The skeletal remains of some long-dead shrub, caught in a shallow depression, looked like a brittle monument to forgotten life. A useless lump of metal, just like everything else. But it wasn't useless. Not really. The previous communication had been a jolt, a rupture in my carefully constructed reality. It wasn't a message in the conventional sense, no discernible language, no sequence of symbols I could hope to decode with terrestrial algorithms. It was more like an impression, a colossal, crushing truth pressed directly into the folds of my consciousness. It was a truth I'd been chasing for years, a truth I now wished I could unknow. My fingers, trembling slightly, reached for the receiver. This contraption, ridiculed by every colleague who'd ever glimpsed it, was my only link. They called it a folk art radio behind my back, a desperate toy for a man teetering on the edge. Let them. They weren't here under this indifferent sky, feeling the weight of the universe settle on their shoulders. It wasn't sound, not truly. It was a presence, a coherent interference pattern that bypassed my ears entirely, resonating instead within the very framework of my thoughts. It was like feeling a colossal, unseen hand press against the inside of my skull, not crushing, but revealing. This time I was ready. I leaned into it, shutting out the dried riverbed, the sun, the memory of the dead phone line. I let the signal wash over me, a tide of pure, unadulterated information. It wasn't a dialogue in any sense I understood. There was no sender, no receiver, just a fundamental truth being unveiled, layer by agonizing layer. What I perceived was not a being, not an intelligence with intent or emotion. It was something far more terrifying, a principle, an absolute, indifferent, cosmic anti-existence. It was the zero from which all numbers sprang, itself unquantifiable, uncreatable, undestroyable. It was the fundamental meaninglessness that underpinned all meaning, a vast, silent no that preceded every yes. The realization hit me with the force of a collapsing star. Every law of physics I'd ever studied, every grand theory of universal expansion and cosmic evolution felt like a child's crayon drawing against the backdrop of an infinite black canvas. My life's work, my desperate search for connection, for understanding, for a grand design withered into dust. There was no design. There was only the anti-existence, vast and uncaring, not even aware of its own presence because awareness itself was a construct, a fleeting ripple on its boundless, silent surface. I gasped, a dry, choked sound, my throat suddenly raw. My hands clenched involuntarily, digging fingernails into my palms, trying to anchor myself to something, anything solid. My own identity, UserXL, the brilliant astrophysicist, the seeker of truth, felt like a character in a forgotten dream, an ephemeral construct dissolving under the glare of this new, terrible understanding. This wasn't communication. This was an unveiling. And what it unveiled was that everything I held dear, every ambition, every human connection, every moment of joy or sorrow was utterly, irredeemably meaningless. The stars above, the dried riverbed, the planet itself, all were temporary, accidental blips against the backdrop of an infinite, unfeeling nothingness. I was no longer just alone in the physical sense. I was alone with this horrifying, nihilistic truth, a truth that had devoured my scientific mind and was now gnawing at the very core of my being. There was no signal, no entity to converse with, and I, UserXL, was the punchline. He hadn't heard me. He couldn't. I was truly alone. My fingers, still clutching the defunct phone, felt like they belonged to someone else. The heat of the sun, usually a comforting weight, now felt like a sterile, indifferent pressure, pressing down on a world that had suddenly lost its anchor. I looked out at the cracked earth, the parched stones, the skeletal remains of what might have once been a vibrant ecosystem. It was all just matter, arranged, disarranged, meaningless. Such intricate structures, so fleeting, the illusion of purpose, a comforting lie spun by the self-replicating carbon. The thought wasn't mine, it had been there, lurking for days, but now it was clearer, sharper, like a new layer of my own consciousness had peeled back to reveal something ancient and vast underneath. My own internal monologue, once a reliable stream of scientific inquiry and personal anxieties, was now a fractured landscape, dotted with these alien intrusions. I needed to write. I needed to document. If I could just put it down, quantify it, categorize it, then maybe I could understand it, or at least keep it from consuming me entirely. My backpack lay beside me, a familiar, reassuring lump. I fumbled for my notebook and pen, the worn leather cover feeling like a lifeline in my trembling hands. The first few lines were my own, a desperate attempt to reclaim my mind. The signal, absolute cosmic indifference, no intent, no purpose, just being. My handwriting was shaky, the ink bleeding slightly on the rough paper. I tried to elaborate, to describe the sensation of that revelation, the way it had peeled back the layers of my carefully constructed reality. Why strive for understanding where there is only arrangement? The patterns exist, yes, but they carry no inherent weight. Your species assigns value, a peculiar adaptation. The voice was louder now, a dissonant chord in my mind, almost conversational in its detached observation. It wasn't speaking to me, not exactly, but through me, like a parallel stream of consciousness. My pen hesitated, hovering over the page. I could feel my own thoughts, my own words, struggling to surface, but they felt weak, flimsy against the sheer, unyielding logic of the other. The entity, it isn't malicious, I wrote, trying to force my own narrative. It's beyond we impose meaning, it simply is. Malice is a construct of limited perception, a reaction to perceived harm. There is no harm, only change, no good, only configuration. My hand inexplicably began to draw, not words but lines, angles, shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves, defying the flat surface of the page. A triangle, but with 3 sides that each seemed to be a different length, yet somehow connected, forming a coherent, impossible whole. Then another nesting within the first, its vertices touching points that shouldn't exist. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile what my hand was doing with what my brain understood. It was non-Euclidean, utterly wrong, yet undeniably beautiful in its terrifying consistency. No, this isn't right, I muttered, trying to shake my head to dislodge the intrusive thoughts, the alien geometry. My head ached, a deep thrumming behind my eyes. I gripped the pen tighter, trying to reassert control. I need to document the impact. The psychological effect. The effect is merely a rearrangement of neural pathways, a recalibration of sensory input. The illusion of self, a fragile construct, shatters under the weight of true scale. My pen moved again, seemingly on its own accord, sketching symbols I'd never seen before. They weren't letters, not glyphs from any human language. They were intricate, fractal-like, each line branching into smaller, identical patterns, creating a dense, almost dizzying tapestry on the page. They felt like a language of pure concept, a visual representation of the indifferent observations now flooding my mind. I tried to write a sentence, a simple declarative statement, but the words that came were fragmented, broken. Existence, a momentary ripple, on an ocean, of no witness required, no narrative, only pattern. My breath hitched. The dried riverbed, the distant hills, the relentless sun, they all seemed to shimmer, to lose their solidity. The world was dissolving, not physically, but conceptually. My notes, once a bastion of scientific rigor, were becoming a testament to my unraveling. I kept writing, kept drawing, my hand moving with a frantic, desperate energy. My own thoughts were like faint echoes in a cavernous space, overwhelmed by the booming, indifferent pronouncements of the entity. It wasn't just observing me anymore. It was in me, reshaping the very architecture of my perception, rebuilding my consciousness with its own alien logic. My breath hitched. The pages filled with scrawled symbols that no longer resembled any known language, intricate diagrams that spiraled into impossible geometries, and frantic observations about the dissolution of form and the unmaking of coherence. I clutched the worn notebook, its binding splitting, the paper soft and brittle from the arid air. The sun, a brutal disk above, felt less like a star and more like an eye, vast and unblinking, observing my final, desperate act of understanding. I was alone in the vast expanse of the dried riverbed, the silence broken only by the rasp of my own breathing and the distant, almost imperceptible hum that had become the constant soundtrack to my existence. It wasn't a sound heard with my ears, not really. It was a vibration in my bones, a resonant frequency that spoke directly to the crumbling architecture of my mind. It was the signal, amplified now beyond anything I could have imagined, no longer a faint whisper from the void, but a roaring torrent within my very being. My determination, once a sharp, focused point, had become a blunt, inescapable compulsion. I had to know, I had to merge. The concept of UserXL felt like a fragile shell cracking under immense pressure. Who was I, really, if not a collection of perceptions and memories that were now dissolving like sugar in hot water? The entity, or whatever it was, wasn't speaking in words. It communicated in pure, unadulterated sensation, a cascade of raw data that bypassed my cognitive filters entirely. I closed my eyes, the harsh light still burning behind my eyelids. The dried riverbed with its cracked clay and scattered stones felt less like solid ground and more like the surface of some impossible organ pulsating faintly beneath me. My body thrummed, a tuning fork struck by an invisible hammer. It was less a visual experience and more a direct infusion of light into my consciousness, bypassing the optic nerve entirely. Then came the sounds, not of the world, but of everything. They weren't distinct sounds. They were interwoven, a single, deafening tapestry of cosmic entropy. My individual thoughts, my memories, my very sense of self, became fleeting motes of dust caught in this immense, indifferent gale. I tried to hold onto a memory, the smell of rain on pavement, the warmth of a familiar voice, the satisfaction of a solved equation, but they slipped through my grasp like grains of sand. They no longer held meaning. They were just data points, no more significant than the trajectory of a forgotten comet. A wave of absolute, unadulterated nothingness washed over me. It wasn't the absence of things, but the presence of no thing. There was no grand architect, no underlying order, no hidden meaning to be deciphered. Only chaos, indifferent and eternal. My consciousness stretched thinner and thinner, pulled taut across an unimaginable distance. I was no longer UserXL. I was the dried riverbed, the distant hills, the unblinking sun. My individual thoughts dissolved, not into madness, but into a terrible, all-encompassing awareness that had no center, no focus, no I. The horror wasn't in pain or fear, but in the profound, absolute meaninglessness of it all. The communion was complete. My breath hitched. The pages filled with sprawling, ink-bled diagrams that defied Euclidean geometry, constellations drawn not from star charts, but from the negative space between stars. Words, fragments of language twisted into new, unsettling significations. The unplace, I'd scrawled repeatedly, its edges blurring into the fibrous paper, the echo of everything where nothing truly is. My fingers traced the lines not with understanding, with a strange, numb familiarity. The air, thin and hot, tasted of dust and something else, something metallic and vast, like the breath of a distant, indifferent void. I didn't feel my own weight anymore, only the persistent, resonant hum that had replaced my heartbeat, a frequency transmitted directly into my bones. The signal. It wasn't just out there. It was in here, occupying the spaces where my thoughts used to be. I rose from the makeshift desk, a stack of crates salvaged from an abandoned mining camp. My movements were fluid, precise, but with an unsettling economy that felt alien to my own memory. The sun, a brutal disk overhead, no longer bothered my eyes. I looked at the array of equipment I had meticulously assembled over the months. Parabolic dishes, signal processors, custom-built receivers humming with subdued power. They felt like extensions of my own nervous system now, conduits for a greater purpose. My gaze fell upon a particularly sensitive antenna, its polished surface reflecting the distorted landscape. I adjusted its calibration, my fingers moving with a speed and accuracy I didn't consciously direct. The dial spun, a soft click marking each increment, until it settled not on a celestial coordinate, but on a point directly beneath the baked earth of the dried riverbed. A low, guttural thrum emanated from the receiver, a sound that vibrated through the ground itself, a silent language spoken to the roots of the world. I began to speak, not to a microphone, but to the receiver itself, my voice flat, devoid of inflection, broadcasting into the earth. It wasn't data or discovery. It was a rhythmic chant, a succession of tonal patterns and non-words that felt ancient and utterly meaningless, yet profoundly significant to the resonant hum that now filled my skull. This was the transmission, not from me but through me. A glint of metal caught my eye. A dust-caked utility vehicle, familiar in its contours, rumbled over the distant, shimmering ridge. The former colleague. He had been persistent in his attempts to reach me, leaving voicemails filled with concern, then frustration, then a strained, desperate worry. I watched him approach, a small, intricate mechanism in the vast, dissolving landscape. He parked a short distance away, kicking up a plume of fine red dust. UserXL. he called out, his voice thin against the immensity of the silence that followed my broadcast. He walked towards me, his gait hesitant, his eyes scanning the array, then me. His face, etched with a mixture of apprehension and relief, searched for something recognizable. "What is all this, UserXL? We've been worried, your last communications. They were just static, broken frequencies. Are you all right?" I turned fully to face him. He stopped a few paces away, his gaze fixed on my eyes, then my hands, which rested on the humming receiver. I saw his initial relief curdle into something else, confusion, then a sudden horror. I saw his mouth open, but no words came out, only a small, involuntary gasp. "Static," I repeated, my voice still flat, detached. Broken frequencies, yes, they were the truest transmissions. My eyes, I knew, held no warmth, no recognition of the man who stood before me. They were windows onto the infinite, indifferent expanse that now resided within me. "Your worry is—" an echo, a pattern of resistance. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the strange symbols on my notes scattered nearby, then back to my face. "UserXL, what are you talking about? This isn't like you. You've been out here too long. The isolation, the sun." He gestured vaguely at the equipment, then the desolate surroundings. "Let's pack it up. We can go back, get some rest. We can talk about the signal then, properly." His voice was strained, trying to inject a normalcy that had long since evaporated. I tilted my head an unnatural angle, like a bird observing a particularly dull insect. "There is no back," I stated, the words forming with deliberate slowness. "Only the continuous unraveling. The proper discussion is the broadcast. The proper rest is the cessation of meaning." His face paled, the last vestiges of hope draining from his expression. "Who is this?" He wasn't asking what was wrong with me, but who I was. His eyes held a stark, terrifying understanding. The man he knew was gone. The presence before him was something else entirely, an entity wearing my flesh, speaking with my tongue, but utterly devoid of my essence. It was the reveal, the absolute, undeniable absence of UserXL. I extended a hand, not to him, but to the air beside him, tracing an invisible pattern, a geometric form that seemed to warp the very light around my fingers. The hum from the receiver intensified, vibrating through the ground, through his feet. He stumbled backward, his hand flying to his mouth to stifle a cry. "I am a pattern," I articulated, the words flowing effortlessly, "a momentary aggregation of no things destined for dissolution, like the riverbed, like the hills, like the light." My gaze swept over the dried riverbed, the distant hills, the relentless sun. They pulsed with the same resonant hum that animated my form. And as I looked, the shimmering intensified, the conceptual boundaries dissolving further, revealing the underlying, horrifying truth of their non-existence. The former colleague turned, scrambling back to his vehicle, his movements frantic, desperate. He didn't look back, driving away in a cloud of dust that was itself just another transient pattern. I watched him go, without emotion, without judgment. He was merely another echo. I returned my attention to the receiver, to the intricate, meaningless patterns forming in the sand at my feet, the constant broadcast of the signal, the relentless hum of the world becoming what it always was, nothing. He stumbled back, his eyes wide, the question who? Who is this, hanging in the air like a shard of ice? He wasn't seeing UserXL anymore, not the man he'd known for years, not the driven, brilliant mind. He saw something else, something that had worn me like a suit. The terror in his gaze wasn't for me, but for what I had become, what I represented. I felt a strange calm settle over me, a quiet understanding. His fear was a testament, a confirmation. He saw the truth, or at least a reflection of it, in my eyes. It wasn't a personal failing, not a descent into madness, but an evolution, a necessary step. The signal had prepared me. It had shown me the way. "It's just me," I said, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. "It's always been me, only now I see." He didn't wait for more. He spun around, scrambling away, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the facility. I watched him go, a fleeting flicker of something akin to pity. He was still bound by the illusion of self, the comforting lie of individual meaning. He wasn't ready to shed the skin, but I was. I had to be. The final phase called to me, a low, resonant thrum beneath my skin. I knew where I needed to go. The place where the atmosphere was thin, where the ground itself was ancient and broken, a testament to time's indifferent march. The dried riverbed. I moved with a purpose that felt both alien and utterly mine. My old equipment, meticulously modified and rewired, waited in the back of my transport. It wasn't the sophisticated arrays I'd once used to capture the signal, but something far more primal, built from salvaged parts and resonant metals I'd collected over weeks. A crude amplifier, a conduit. Its purpose wasn't to receive, but to send. The drive was a blur of dust and faded landscapes. The sun was a weary eye in the sky by the time I reached the edge of the vast, cracked expanse. The dried riverbed stretched out before me, a desolate canvas of ochre and rust scored by the ghost of a forgotten torrent. The air was still heavy with the scent of dry earth and mineral dust. This was the perfect crucible. This was where the signal would find its voice. I unloaded the device, a strange contraption of copper coils, jagged crystalline structures, and a central humming resonator. It looked like a child's crude attempt at an antenna, yet within it, the entity's influence pulsed. I set it up at the deepest part of the riverbed, where the ground was most fractured, like the shattered remnants of a colossal, forgotten mirror. As I connected the final wires, a wave of understanding washed over me, a clarity so stark it almost buckled my knees. The signal wasn't just a revelation of meaninglessness. It was an invitation, an active principle of dissolution. It wasn't content with passive observation. It sought to integrate, to homogenize, to bring everything into its indifferent embrace. My identity, my consciousness, my very sense of being UserXL, these were merely the first ripples in a cosmic tide. The entity was a force of ultimate entropy, not just a state, but a hunger. A quiet, consuming hunger that sought to erase all distinction, all individuality, all the frantic, desperate clamor of existence. This was the truth: the universe was not merely empty, it was actively being emptied. My fingers, guided by an unseen will, moved with precision. I flipped the final switch. A low thrum vibrated through the ground, a sound felt more than heard. The air around the device shimmered, distorting the already warped landscape. The crystalline structures began to glow, not with light, but with a deep internal resonance that seemed to drink the ambient light. It was the sound of the signal, no longer merely received, but amplified, given form, ready to be unleashed. I felt a pull, a gentle tugging at the edges of my perception, my very being. It was like being stretched thin, like my atoms were unraveling, eager to join the broadcast. My vision blurred, the cracked earth swirling into abstract patterns. The whine intensified, becoming a silent scream in my mind, a symphony of pure, unadulterated meaninglessness. I was becoming part of it, dissolving into the very thing I had sought to understand. My body felt insubstantial, a mere vessel now shedding its form. The last thing I saw was the device, pulsing with an inner light that was not light at all, but pure, unadulterated truth. And then, a final, overwhelming surge. The ground beneath me seemed to liquefy, not physically but perceptually. I was no longer standing. I was no longer anything distinct. I was merely an echo, a resonance, part of the outgoing current. The hum continued, spreading across the dried riverbed, a subtle vibration that hinted at something vast and incomprehensible now unleashed. The device itself, still radiating that strange, light-devouring glow, remained. But the air around it, where I had stood, was empty. No body, no trace. Just the lingering scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and ancient, like the taste of starlight. The signal, the entity's truth, was out there now, and it was only just beginning its patient, indifferent work.